now it is quite common to hear people, progressives in particular, say that sex actually doesn't have any intrinsic value to it. It doesn't have any intrinsic specialness. Like, if people want to apply meaning to it on a personal level, they're welcome to. But when it comes down to it, it's just a social interaction. You know, you can buy it, you can sell it, it's fine. I don't think anyone really believes that. I think almost no one actually believes that. And you can tell because people are extraordinarily inconsistent in applying this. So people who, for instance, will say that sex work is work, no problem, it's just like working at McDonald's, will not apply that to their own personal lives, or not even apply it to other sort of similar issues in terms of law and policy. So the example I give in the book is sex for rent. All of the major political parties in the UK are united in believing that landlords who offer rooms in exchange for sexual favours are or should be breaking the law. They're all united in saying we should have firmer laws on it. This is particularly post-COVID because there was sort of a rash of landlords doing this. It's the same in other Western countries as well. These are exactly the same parties, you know, like the Lib Dems, for instance, condemn sex for rent and think we should decriminalise the sex industry. It's the same thing. You know, it's just goods, you know, being exchanged for sexual access. It's exactly the same thing. And similarly, you know, people who will, again, say that sex work is work, that you know, really buy into the sexual disenchantment idea rhetorically, very upset about any perceived sexual impropriety in their own workplaces. You know, like having any kind of being touched by a male colleague, being asked out on a date, like that stuff is very serious and is not at all comparable to just other forms of non-sexual interaction. But sex work is work, you know. And I think that inconsistency is a result of the fact that actually sexual disenchantment just isn't true. and basically no one really thinks it's true. But the problem is that if you are trying to rationalise it all and you are applying kind of utility brain to the world, it's quite hard to articulate, it's quite hard to rationalise. It comes from a very visceral place, which is a bit inconvenient if you're trying to apply that kind of, you know, very logical worldview. The fact that people have emotional responses to things that are somewhat inconvenient, you know. But the truth of it is that people don't feel that sex is the same as other social interactions. People absolutely feel that sex has some unique status, which is, of course, why, I mean, thinking from a feminist perspective, which is why rape is so uniquely bad, which is why sexual harassment is so uniquely bad. If you don't think sex is special, you can't think any of those things have special status either. And I think that idea of sexual disenchantment is bad for everyone, but it's really bad for women.
Why?
Partly because of a physical imbalance between the sexes. So the fact that it's only women who get pregnant. Women have to suffer the side effects of hormonal contraception. Women are much smaller and weaker than men, which means that any heterosexual encounter, if you've got a man and woman alone together, the woman's going to be almost always the more physically vulnerable party. So there's that kind of risk inherent to sexual encounters that women experience that men can't experience in the same way. There's also the psychological stuff, and that's more controversial because the push towards kind of radical equality within feminism, in liberal feminism, has also included pushing back very hard against the idea that there are any innate differences between the sexes on a psychological level. And some of that is coming from a good place. It's clearly the case that in various periods in history, pseudoscientific ideas about women's intellectual inferiority in particular, or emotional inferiority, have been used against women. This is clearly true. That does not, however, mean that those differences don't exist at all. And actually, as decades have gone by and we've got more and more scientific research on this, it actually becomes more and more apparent that those differences do exist on average, right? The on average thing is something that people often can't wrap their heads around.
Well, they can, they just don't want to. Yeah.
Well, people can when it comes to something like, the example I give is like, you know, if we say that Germans are on average taller than people from Spain, people are like, oh yeah, fine. No one says, oh, but I know a really tall guy from Spain. That disproves your thesis. You know, this is the nature of bell curves. There are all sorts of ways in which the certain psychological traits differ on the bell curve basis between men and women. The one that's most important for my purposes is the trait that psychologists call sociosexuality, which is not quite the same as sex drive, You can be, high in one and low in the other, but sociosexuality is about your desire for casual sex, basically. How much you want to have sex with a variety of people, how quickly you want to jump into bed with someone.
Now, look, I'm not an expert, but I'm going to guess men are more prone to have a higher rate of that.
Cross-culturally, trans-historically, yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm a genius. How did I work that out,
I know.
Louise?
How dare you notice these things? But, yes, I mean, anyone who's got eyes and lived in the world can tell that there clearly is that average difference between men and women, even if there are lots of outliers on an individual level. I mean, just because you know someone's sex doesn't mean you know their level of sociosexuality. But at the population level, you see it. You see it, for instance, in the fact that almost all sex buyers everywhere in the world are male. Because obviously the people who it's that tail of high sociosexuality is all men, right? Look,
I'm going to say something even more controversial than you, but basically, if you want to understand what men are actually like, just look at gay men, right? How much sex do they have, and how many partners do they have on average compared to the average heterosexual man? And you kind of get, gay men are actually the real men because they're unrestrained by women.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
It's really that simple.
Yeah, it's how men would behave if women weren't a limiting factor.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting if you look at the survey data on gay men, of which there's quite a lot because it comes out of sexual health research and stuff. What you have is actually a goodish proportion of men who are just as monogamous as lesbians. And you have a lot of men in the middle. And then you have a proportion who are really promiscuous. And because there isn't the limiting factor of women saying no, those men are way more promiscuous than promiscuous straight men can ever be, because they just have so much more opportunity. But that proportion of would-be promiscuous straight men still exists. It's just they've got the complexity of having to deal with female choice, which makes the whole heterosexual, dating marriage scene that much more complex.